Okay, let me ask you something. What if you could achieve, like, vastly more, but with way less effort? And what if the world, maybe your job, even your own happiness, what if it's all fundamentally, well, wonky? But in a way that, once you get it, you can use it for some incredible progress. Today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that, the 80-20 principle. You might know it as the Pareto Principle. So our mission today is to unpack where it came from, some surprising origins there, and how it applies to pretty much everything. Business strategies, sure, but also your personal happiness. And really, how it can give you a shortcut to being, well-informed about getting more done with less fuss. All the insights we're talking about today, they're drawn from detailed excerpts of a really foundational book on this. The 80-20 Principle, the secret to achieving more with less. Grad. So the core idea basically is that just a small fraction of causes often leads to the huge majority of effects. And understand this isn't just like an interesting tidbit. It can generally transform how you approach things. So let's get into it. What exactly is this 80-20 principle?
Right. So the 80-20 principle, well, it basically tells us that in pretty much any system, some things you put in are likely going to be way more important than others. The main concept is that about 80% of your results, your outputs, they typically flow from just 20% of the causes, the inputs. Now, it's really important to get this. It's not always exactly 80-20. Think of it more like a benchmark, a hypothesis maybe. Sometimes the imbalance is, well, much more extreme.
Much more extreme. You mean like an 801? I'm thinking about that surprising fact about language you mentioned.
That's a perfect example, yeah.
Yeah.
Sir Isaac Pitman, he invented shorthand, that super fast writing system, still used for speed.
Right.
He figured out that just 700 common words, they make up about 2/3 of our everyday conversation. And if you add their derivatives, variations of those words, it accounts for 80% of common speech.
Wow. So less than 1% of all the words we have access to.
Are used 80% of the time. It's a really stark illustration of this kind of imbalance. And what's really fascinating here is, where did this whole idea even start, this underlying pattern? It was actually spotted way back in 1897 by an Italian economist, Vilfredo Pareto. He was looking at how wealth and income were spread out in Italy at the time.
And he just saw this pattern, this predictable imbalance in wealth.
Exactly. He noticed that something like 80% of the land in Italy was owned by just 20% of the people. But it's important to clarify Pareto himself. He never actually used the phrase 80-20.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, his mathematical formula just described this consistent relationship he saw between the top earners and the total income. The 80-20 label came later, made it easier to grasp, But the core math, that was Pareto.
Okay, so the shorthand 80-20 came later.
Yeah.
But the idea itself, it didn't just stop there. It kept evolving through some maybe less famous pioneers.
It absolutely did. You had George K. Ziff. He was a Harvard linguist. He picked up on it, applied it to language, and then to workplace efficiency. He even pointed out that, files you use all the time, maybe you shouldn't even file them, recognizing that huge effort for tiny gain.
Huh, makes sense.
Then, jump to 1951. Joseph Moses Juran. He was a Romanian-born U.S. engineer, a real quality control guru. He popularized it as the rule of the vital few. And he was hugely influential in transforming Japanese industry, helped him tackle quality issues way before his ideas really caught on in the West, which wasn't until after 1970, really.
That's a massive impact. And it wasn't just manufacturing quality, was it? It started popping up in, technology, too.
Oh, definitely. IBM was a really key early adopter. In 1963, they stumbled upon something pretty profound. They found that about 80% of a computer's processing time was spent executing just 20% of its operating code.
Get out. That's incredible for hardware. Most of the machine's power was used for just a tiny fraction of the instructions.
Yeah.
No wonder they rewrote the software.
Oh, precisely. That insight, it led them to immediately rewrite their software. They made that crucial 20% super accessible, really user-friendly, made their computers way, way more efficient. And then, the next wave of pioneers in personal computing, Apple, Lotus, Microsoft, that they took this principle and ran with it even harder to make machines cheaper, easier to use.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Why does this pattern keep showing up everywhere? We're so conditioned to think linearly, A causes B, simple cause and effect. But this principle points to something nonlinear. Why is the universe so, wonky like this?
Yeah, it's a great question. The world often operates away from equilibrium. Things aren't always nicely balanced or proportional. The whole system is often more than just the sum of its parts. The economist Paul Krugman, he called this predictable nonlinearity spooky and terrifyingly exact. Mm-hmm. It's not chaos, like a total mess you can't understand. It's more like a self-organizing logic where certain patterns just keep recurring.
Okay, so what's driving this this predictable weirdness? What are the mechanisms behind the wonkiness?
Well, one really key mechanism is something called positive feedback loops. Just think about it. The rich often get richer, right? And it's not always just because they're smarter or work harder. Sometimes wealth itself just creates more wealth.
Like money makes money.
Exactly. Or picture a pond full of goldfish. Maybe they start out roughly the same size, but the ones that are just slightly bigger, they tend to get much bigger. Why? Because even tiny advantages at the start, maybe they swim a bit faster, have slightly bigger mouth, lets them grab way more food. So small edges get amplified into big results. And this raises a really important question. If things aren't linear, how do we even spot these patterns? How do we use them? Related to these feedback loops is this idea of the tipping point. It comes from epidemic theory, actually. So imagine a new force could be a product, a social trend, an idea. It often struggles to get going, right? Up to a certain point. You might put in a ton of effort and see very little happen.
Yeah, pushing a boulder uphill.
Right. But if that force keeps pushing and crosses some kind of invisible line, then suddenly just a little bit more effort can trigger huge returns. It's like when a minor flu outbreak suddenly becomes a massive epidemic, or a small trend just explodes.
And we see this very clearly with the winner-take-all phenomenon, don't we? Mm-hmm. That's a really stark illustration, sometimes even more extreme than 80-20.
Absolutely. Yeah. You look at superstars like Steven Spielberg, the director. He reportedly earned $165 million back in 1994. Or top lawyers like Joseph Jamel, $90 million. They earn astronomically more than professionals who are merely, very competent.
Yeah, it's not just a little bit more.
Not at all. And it's not just entertainment. It's happening more and more across different professions, where a tiny few at the top capture almost all the rewards. Think about U.S. income inequality. During the 1980s, get this, 64%, nearly two-thirds of the total increase in income went to the top 1% of earners. It just shows how this 80-20 principle, or maybe even 955 or 991, it keeps reasserting itself in the market unless there are huge ongoing efforts to counter it.
Okay, so understanding this pervasive winner-take-all thing, how can businesses actually use this wonkiness to their advantage? Instead, it's just being caught up in it. The book talks about two approaches. 80-20 analysis versus 80-20 thinking.
That's right. So 80-20 analysis, that's more of an empirical thing. You use data. You actually measure what's happening to find these imbalances. Maybe it turns out to be 65-35 in your case, or like you said, even 99.9, 0.1. The term 80-20 just becomes a kind of shorthand for any of these unbalanced distributions you find through data.
Gotcha. Do you have any really striking examples from the book where a business did this analysis and found some crazy numbers?
Oh, yeah. There's a great one about Electronic Instruments, Inc. They did the analysis, and the figures were pretty stark. For example, just 30% of the products they sold, they accounted for nearly 67%, two-thirds of their total profits.
Wow.
And customers. The most profitable 15% of their customers brought in 59% of the profits, and the top 25%, a massive 88%.
That's incredible. So most customers weren't actually that profitable.
Exactly. Even looking at old versus new clients,
right.
26% of their established old clients made up 84% of their profits. It just hammers home the power of focusing on that vital few. Then, in contrast, you have 80-20 thinking. This is more judgment-based. It's faster. It doesn't necessarily need hard data up front. You basically think deeply about an important issue and make an educated guess, a judgment call about where the 80-20 principle might be operating. It's a quicker, more intuitive way to apply it, though, you have to be careful. It could occasionally mislead if your intuition is off.
I see. Analysis gives you the hard facts. Thinking lets you move faster. So connecting this to the bigger picture for companies, the book argues complexity has these huge hidden costs. Can you expand on that? What are these invisible drains?
Yeah, they're really insidious because they are largely invisible. Things like communication breakdowns between more departments, gaps between different processes, just generally slowing the whole system down. A business might look efficient on the surface, but if you layer on too many products, too many types of customers, too many internal functions, you start bleeding profit without really knowing why.
And that leads to this idea that simple is beautiful. Right, even for big companies.
Exactly. There was this careful study of 39 German companies, and it found that simplicity, things like narrower product lines, fewer customers, fewer suppliers, that was the only common factor that really differentiated the winners from the less successful ones.
Just
simplicity. When you understand the true cost of all that hidden complexity, it suddenly makes sense why maybe a fifth of your revenues could be generating 4/5 of your profits. So By ruthlessly cutting that complexity, maybe outsourcing things that aren't core, or even getting rid of some central management functions, businesses can often dramatically boost profits, sometimes even raise prices because they're focusing on what truly matters to their best customers and cutting out the waste.
That's a really powerful shift in how to think about a business. So let's get practical. Where are businesses seeing the biggest wins when they actually apply this principle?
Okay, one of the absolute top uses is in marketing and sales. It's pretty straightforward, really. Focus on that 20% of products generating 80% of the profits. And crucially, cherish that core 20% of customers who provide the bulk of your sales and profits.
That loyalty pays off.
Hugely. Like in telecoms, knowing exactly who your top revenue generating customers are is vital. Sales team effort should be heavily concentrated on this vital 20%. And it's often worth going back to old, historically profitable customers, too. It's all about putting your energy where you get the biggest bang for your buck.
Makes total sense. Focus on the gold mine. Nurture those relationships. Okay, what about decision-taking? This feels like an area where 80-20 could slice through a lot of confusion.
It absolutely can. The principle offers some really powerful rules of thumb here. For example, there's Rule 3, sometimes called the 80-20-100-100 rule. It basically says, gather 80% of the data and do 80% of the analysis in the first 20% of the time you have available. Then, make a decision 100% and act on it with 100% confidence.
Right, so it's about acting decisively with good enough information, not waiting forever for perfection.
Yeah.
That's powerful. But what's the biggest trap people fall into when they try to, double down on what's working like the book suggests?
Yeah.
How do you avoid getting overconfident?
That's Rule 5. When something is working really well, double and redouble your bets. The mistake. Often it's fear. Fear of commitment, fear of failure.
Holding back.
Exactly. People tend to diversify too much, maybe, hedge their bets, or just don't fully commit when something is clearly succeeding. Venture capitalists get this, and they know a few superstar investments will likely carry the whole portfolio, making up for many failures. It's about recognizing that disproportionate success and having the guts to amplify it.
That's a great mindset for grabbing opportunities. Okay, how about project management? How does 80-20 help keep projects on track?
For projects, the principle really emphasizes stripping them down. Get to one simple core aim, and then it's just imposing impossible timescales, like demand a prototype in 4 weeks flat, or get a pilot program live in 3 months.
That sounds stressful.
It is, but it forces the team to apply the 80-20 rule, whether they realize it or not. They have to focus only on the 20% of activities that deliver 80% of the real value. They just don't have time for the nice-to-haves or getting bogged down in unnecessary complexity.
Okay, I see the logic. And finally, negotiation. How does 80-20 play out there?
In negotiations, turns out very few points actually matter that much. Roughly 20% of the issues being discussed will probably account for over 80% of the total value being negotiated.
So identify what really matters.
Precisely. The strategy suggested is to maybe build up a longer list of spurious concerns early on, make them seem important. Then, later in the final stages, you can strategically concede these less important points. But in return, you secure more than your fair share of the stuff that actually has high value. It's also interesting, the book notes that often 80% of the concessions happen in the last 20% of the negotiation time. So patience really pays off.
Okay, let's pivot this. Let's talk about your personal life. Beyond the boardroom, the 80-20 principle apparently promises to, make you free, help you work less, and earn and enjoy more. The book even describes 80-20 thinking as almost hedonistic. What's that about?
Yeah, hedonistic in this context means it actively seeks pleasure. It operates on the belief that life is actually meant to be enjoyed. And it suggests that most real achievement, it's often a byproduct of genuine interest, joy, and, the desire for future happiness. Now, that might sound kind of obvious.
But it's not how most people operate.
Well, the truth is, most people waste a lot of time on activities they don't actually enjoy, often with people they don't really like that much. And a lot of that comes down to sort of guilt. Guilt over prioritizing joy or what feels good.
So we're trapped by obligation, maybe, or guilt. And that stops us focusing on what really makes us happy or productive. That's a fascinating perspective.
It really is. And that's why 80-20 thinking is fundamentally optimistic, because it reveals that our current state is often seriously below what it should be. By consciously focusing on that vital 20% that genuinely brings you happiness or gets you results, you can actually multiply your output, your progress, instead of just fiddling around the edges making tiny improvements, which, raises a really important question. What does all this mean for our time? The 80-20 principle really throws down a challenge to conventional time management. It basically assumes that how you're currently using your time is probably irrational, and because of that, just making marginal tweaks won't really help much.
Wow. Okay, so it's not about cramming more into every minute, but about a radical rethink of what we spend time on in the first place. That sounds liberating, but maybe a little scary too.
Exactly. The principle argues there's actually no shortage of time. We're practically awash with it, apparently. But the kicker is, we only make good use of about 20% of it. So here's the radical idea. If you somehow doubled the time you spend on your top 20% most productive, most enjoyable activities, you could potentially work a 2-day week and still achieve 60% more than you do now.
A 2-day week? Seriously?
That's the provocative math. It's about treating time as a friend, not an enemy, and realizing that productivity could maybe double just by, say, having the time allowed for projects.
Yeah.
It forces that intense focus.
That sounds a lot like productive laziness, a concept the book mentions, which I gotta say sounds incredibly appealing. Can you give us some examples of what that looks like?
Sure. Think about Ronald Reagan. He went from being, a B-movie actor to a very successful U.S. president. He achieved, awesome results, as the book puts it, with what some might see as limited effort or application. He relied heavily on his natural charm, his communication skills, and having really sharp advisors and campaign managers.
Playing to his strengths.
Exactly. Or look at Warren Buffett. Became one of the richest people on earth, not through frantic activity, but through investing. His philosophy, the book says, borders on lethargy. He buys very few stocks, holds them for ages, and kind of scoffs at constant diversification. These guys exemplify how massive results can come from highly focused effort, rather than just exhaustive, brute force work. It's about figuring out what really moves the needle and pouring your energy there.
That is a truly liberating thought. So, okay, let's apply these 80-20 insights to our own lives. How do you actually identify your personal happiness or achievement islands? It sounds simple, but I bet it's tricky in practice.
Right. It starts with asking yourself honestly, what are the 20% of my activities or the 20% of my time that genuinely yield 80% of my achievements or 80% of my happiness? You need to be specific. Then, once you've identified them, the core advice is find ways to multiply the time you spend on those things. And the flip side, ruthlessly eliminate, or at least drastically reduce, the 80% of activities that only give you back 20% of the results or joy you want. The real challenge, I think, is that brutal honesty with yourself about where you're truly getting value versus just being busy.
And this isn't just about tasks, right? It applies to relationships too. The book says our friendships are at the heart of our lives.
Absolutely. The 80-20 principle works here too. The suggestion is to identify your top 20 friends and loved ones, the people who provide 80% of your relationship value, your support, your joy, and connection. The source mentions something called the village theory. It suggests that the number of truly significant close relationships we can really maintain is surprisingly consistent for most people, no matter where they live. So the advice is, fill those limited relationship slots very carefully. Because spreading yourself too thin with superficial connections can actually exhaust your capacity for the deeper ones that truly matter. Quality over quantity, basically.
Makes sense. And what about professional relationships? Allies at work?
Oh, you badly need allies professionally. The book lays out these 5 ingredients for strong alliances: mutual enjoyment, respect, shared experience, reciprocity, give and take, and trust. It suggests actively cultivating just a few key alliances. Maybe 1 or 2 mentors, people senior to you or clearly going places. 2 or 3 peers you can rely on. And maybe 1 or 2 mentees where you're the one giving guidance. Because the value you get from allies, it's highly skewed. A few key people will be far, far more important than everyone else combined.
Okay, let's talk career and money through the 80-20 lens. Being intelligent and lazy in your career sounds like the dream job description. How does that work?
For your career, the advice is aimed to be intelligent and lazy. Which means choose a very small niche, something you genuinely enjoy, and something you can become truly excellent at. The principle argues that in almost any organization or profession, 80% of the value comes from 20% of the professionals.
It's the top performers.
Exactly. So the logical step, if you're ambitious, is maybe to become self-employed and then eventually hire others. That way you capture more of that disproportionate value you're creating. And money. Well, money definitely obeys the 80-20 principle. Big time. Investment income is far more likely to build serious wealth than income from just working a job. Think about Ann Scheiber. This woman turned $5,000 into $22 million. How? By investing in blue chip stocks, solid established companies, and just holding them for decades. Patience and focus.
That is an amazing story.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key investing rules from an 80-20 standpoint?
Well, a couple of key rules are: call your loss makers. Basically, sell shares if they drop by a set amount, say 15%, to cut your losses quickly. And the other side is run your games. Resist that urge to sell your winning investments too early just to lock in a profit, because often 80% of your total gains will come from just 20% of your investments. Let your winners ride.
Protect the downside, maximize the upside.
Got it. And what about just like daily happiness? Are there 80-20 shortcuts or habits we should focus on for that?
Yes, definitely. The book suggests focusing on certain vital daily habits that have a disproportionately large impact on your overall well-being. For instance, exercise, often seen as a keystone habit, right?
Yeah.
Just a consistent 20 or 30 minutes can create ripples, more energy, better mood, clearer thinking that far outweigh the actual time spent.
Yeah, I feel that. Same with mental stimulation, like actively learning something new. And spiritual or artistic stimulation, even just for a short period. These can give you disproportionate returns in fulfillment and perspective. It's really about finding those small, consistent actions that trigger the biggest positive feedback loops for your happiness.
I can definitely see how a good workout makes the whole rest of the day feel more productive. So, beyond those daily things, any broader shortcuts to happiness the book mentions?
Yeah, some broader strategies. The principle suggests trying to maximize control over your own life, setting goals that are attainable rather than overly ambitious ones that just set you up for disappointment, being flexible. And interestingly, developing a close relationship with a partner who's already happy, the book really stresses choosing someone who genuinely adds to your happiness.
Choose happy people.
Essentially, yeah. And cultivate a few happy friends. And just continuously evolve your lifestyle towards what ideally works for you. It all comes back to identifying what genuinely contributes to your happiness and then finding ways to multiply that instead of chasing every little thing.
Okay, let's zoom out again. If we connect this 80-20 idea to the bigger picture, society-wide, it definitely highlights some pretty profound questions. This winner-take-all trend seems to be driving more social inequality. And there's this fear, right, of a 20.80 society. I know the World Economic Forum has talked about it, and there was that German book, The Global Trap, this idea where maybe only 20% of people have meaningful work and the other 80% are kind of left behind.
Right, and this raises that really crucial question. Are the doomsters right about this? Is this widening gap just an inevitable consequence of free markets and technology? The source material actually argues pretty strongly that both the pessimists and the revolutionaries calling for a drastic overhaul are probably wrong here.
Oh, why is that?
Because history, it argues, consistently shows something else. Progress driven by new tech, more efficiency. It doesn't just lead to huge improvements in living standards for basically all groups in market economies. It also tends to lead to higher total levels of employment in the long run.
So jobs change, but no one's emerge.
Exactly. There might be short-term pain, like maybe managers losing jobs as companies simplify. But that releases purchasing power into the economy, which then creates demand for new kinds of jobs, often in smaller businesses and service industries. The market adjusts.
Okay, so it's a call for some optimism then, despite the challenges we see. So how does 80-20 thinking apply to public policy to try to address some of these issues, especially something like education? It feels like we often focus on the wrong levers there.
That's a key point the book makes. The 80-20 principle can, and it argues, must be applied to education. There was a study by the Brookings Institute, looked at 500 U.S. high schools, found that the usual suspects, how much money was spent, teacher salaries, class sizes, they actually made no significant difference to student performance.
Really?
Yeah.
None.
According to that study, no. The factors that did matter, the key, 20%. Things like parental control and involvement, having a clear mission for the school, strong leadership, autonomy for the school, and importantly, freedom and respect for the teachers. It strongly suggests that the 20% of factors that truly drive results are often not the ones getting the most attention or funding.
Wow, that's a powerful argument for shifting focus in education. Completely turns conventional wisdom on its head. What about healthcare?
Healthcare is another area where 80-20 suggests unconventional approaches. The U.S. Surgeon General, years ago, found that something like 50% of all illness is linked to personal behavior, diet, exercise, smoking, etc. And only about 10% is down to the actual medical care received.
50% behavioral, only 10% medical care.
Yeah. Yet where do healthcare budgets overwhelmingly go? To corrective medical care, hospitals, treatments, the 80-20 perspective would argue for shifting massive energy and resources towards health education and prevention, especially early on, trying to hit those tipping points where small behavioral changes by many people yield huge returns in overall public health. So maybe that means more focus on nutritionists, accessible gyms, better parks, And perhaps counterintuitively, fewer hospitals needed in the long run.
Fascinating. And even crime reduction. The book uses the New York City example from the 90s, which was pretty dramatic.
Yes, absolutely. New York City, under Police Commissioner William Bratton back then, saw this stunning drop in crime starting around 1993. His zero-tolerance strategy wasn't about cracking down equally on everything. It specifically focused on the 20% of offenders and the types of situations like public drinking, graffiti, turnstile jumping that seem to be causing or enabling 80% of the more serious crime.
The broken windows idea, sort of?
Exactly. By putting massive targeted effort into those specific pivotal offenses, they seemed to hit a tipping point. It didn't just reduce those minor crimes, it appeared to transform the atmosphere in entire neighborhoods, leading to drops in major crime too. It was a very clear application of focusing resources on the vital few factors that make the biggest difference. Now, when you talk about using 80-20 for social intervention, the book raises two big buts, two important caveats. First, the solutions that come out of 80-20 thinking, they're often going to be unconventional, very pragmatic. They probably won't fit neatly into traditional left-wing or right-wing political boxes.
Like the healthcare example, focusing on prevention might upset established interests.
Precisely. It steers towards what works based on the imbalance, even if it challenges how things are usually done or funded.
Okay, and the second but. It sounds like it's about the role of the state itself. The principle seems to suggest that government shouldn't necessarily be the one doing everything.
Exactly. The second point is that the state's track record as a direct provider of services is often pretty inefficient according to the 80-20 lens. State-run services frequently fall into that category of the 80% of activity that only delivers 20% of the real value. So the implication is generally minimal state economic intervention because markets are usually much better at arbitrage, at finding efficiencies, which the state isn't really built for. But it argues for potentially ambitious, highly focused social intervention, where the state acts more as a facilitator, setting goals, enabling others, maybe funding, but not necessarily providing the services directly. Decentralization, maybe using private or nonprofit models, often works better. So the overall message is that the 80-20 principle offers this kind of radical, performance-driven way to achieve massive improvements in society, just by relentlessly focusing on the few things that truly deliver the goods.
Wow. Okay, so we've really journeyed through the 80-20 principle today. From its surprising origins and that whole wonky logic behind it, to its incredible power to transform business, your personal life, and maybe even tackle big societal problems. It's clear it's not just, an interesting observation. It's really a prescriptive tool, a way to spot huge inefficiencies everywhere and make real, significant improvements in almost any part of your life. So here's something to think about as we wrap up. What stands out to you about how disproportionate effort and reward seem to be in your own life? Or maybe in your organization? Is your life, or maybe your business, feeling kind of wonky because you're stuck applying 50-50 thinking in what is clearly an 80-20 world? And maybe more importantly, what's one simple, focused change you could make, maybe even starting today, to begin living this principle?